Welcome to the first episode of Lowkey Interviews, and today we are joined by somebody who is really going to enlighten us. He rose to prominence in the 70s as a very well-known campaigner against the Vietnam War and was so troublesome that he was placed upon Richard Nixon's enemies list. He has published over 100 books, and I am talking about none other than the man, the myth, the legend, Noam Chomsky. Thanks for joining us, Noam. You have said before that if you could, you would vote for Jeremy Corbyn. But if you were to believe the mainstream media in this country, he has a problem with anti-Semitism. How do you read that?
Well, I've looked at those charges. I don't think they have any credibility. Undoubtedly, there's a degree of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, pretty much like the rest of the population. Nothing beyond that. The charges, if you look at them closely, are mostly related to criticisms of Israeli policy. The Labour Party under the previous leadership has been strongly supportive of Israel overwhelmingly, and Corbyn is not. He takes a position which is critical of Israeli crimes, of Israeli human rights violations. Other members of the Labour Party do as well, and this is being used as a basis for defamatory charges, in my view. You can find things, undoubtedly. You look anywhere, you're going to find bits and pieces of anti-Semitism, racism, misogyny, whatever it may be, but I don't think there's any serious basis for this.
Well, with the statement which was recently secretly recorded of Mike Pompeo saying that the United States would take steps to prevent a Jeremy Corbyn government, knowing that the US interfered in Australian democracy to remove Gough Whitlam from power in the 70s, is it not likely that the United States would interfere in British democracy to prevent a Jeremy Corbyn government?
The United States is powerful, but not all powerful. Europe chose extreme policies of neoliberal austerity. The European Union was designed in ways which undermine popular democracy. The major decisions in Europe are not taken by Italians for Italy, by French for France. They're taken by the bureaucracy in Brussels, unelected bureaucracy, the Troika, European Commission, unelected, IMF, obviously unelected, European Central Bank. They make the basic decisions. The policies they followed, the austerity policies, were very destructive for much of the population. The United States didn't carry out great policies, but better than that. And the result of that is an enormous amount of anger, bitterness, resentment, often takes pathological forms. It leaves people open to demagogues who will try to exploit scapegoats, immigrants, whatever it may be. So yes, it's in a very bad situation. But these were decisions made in Europe. The United States is in the background, but can't blame the United States for that. Same thing in Australia. A lot to say about it, but these are powerful regions. They make their own decisions, not out of the context of world affairs, but with plenty of freedom. And this neoliberal wave that spread over the world since Reagan and Thatcher had very harsh consequences for a considerable majority of the population. Like in the United States, for example, the real wages today are about what they were in the 1960s, 1979, before the neoliberal programs began. The programs have sharply concentrated wealth led to undermining of benefits, stagnation for much of the population, an economy that's increasingly precarious for individuals. Of course, the high concentration of wealth itself, almost automatically leads to erosion of functioning democracy by means that we described and are pretty obvious. So yes, you have a pretty ugly and difficult situation in much of the world.
In your book, Optimism Over Despair, you say that it is unlikely civilization can survive really existing capitalism. Can you explain that statement to us, please?
Well, really existing capitalism is what we can see described in the press day after day. So, for example, euphoric articles in the New York Times, Financial Times, and elsewhere about how the United States has leaped past Saudi Arabia in oil production, is now first in the world. It's opening new oil fields for exploitation, offshore oil that now can go back to the time when it was dominating world oil production. We read that the major banks like J.P. Morgan Chase are increasing their investment in fossil fuels, including the most dangerous, like Canadian tar sands. And all of this is quite understandable on the assumption that the structure of our institutions is geared to maximizing short-term profit and power without regard to what might happen to the world in another 20 or 30 years. That's called capitalism. Well, we can't survive that. Now, there are ways in which existing institutions could be modified so that they will deal with the literally existential crises that are coming before us. And it's conceivable that they might, that even their self-destructive business model might offer a way out, simply because the costs of renewables, solar and wind, basically, are declining fast enough so that it might become more profitable to try to save the world than to try to destroy it. But that's a pretty weak reed to rely on.
Now, Noam, before you have said that we as a species are in the midst of a sixth extinction or an Anthropocene. Can you explain to us what those terms mean?
We are in the midst of the sixth extinction. That's not particularly debatable. The sixth extinction refers to the rate of species destruction underway. Over geological time, there have been a number of periods when there was massive extinction of species. The last one was the fifth extinction, about 65 million years ago. It's assumed, not certain, but it's likely that it was caused by a huge asteroid hitting the Earth, which led to the destruction of most of the species, most of the existing species. In particular, it ended the age of the dinosaurs. They were wiped out, and it left an opening for certain small mammals, which did survive and ultimately proliferated and ultimately became hominids and ultimately Homo sapiens, who are now engaging or initiating, in fact, carrying out the sixth extinction. That's what we're doing. We're the asteroid. And in fact, the rate of species destruction is shocking. across the board. In many ways, the most dangerous is the radical destruction of the insect population. It's been declining extremely sharply. Places where it's been monitored closely, like Germany and a few others. It's probably worldwide. If they substantially disappear, along with them goes fertilization of crops, the basis for much of the rest of life. And this is not just exotic species which are disappearing. Of course, that's happening. But there's a very serious threat of a substantial something of the character of the fifth extinction. And it's happening quite fast, faster than in earlier periods. So that's underway. That's one of the consequences of not only global warming, but also habitat destruction, other impacts on the human impacts on the environment.
No, you are quoted as saying that the CEOs responsible for dragging us to the sixth extinction love profits more than they love their grandchildren. What do you mean by that?
They seem not to be concerned about the future of their grandchildren. Well, you have to put yourself in the position of, say, Jamie Dimon, the CEO of the biggest bank, J.P. Morgan Chase. As CEO, he has essentially two choices. One choice is to do exactly what he's doing, invest direct investments to the most profitable outcome. If it happens to be the most dangerous fossil fuels, do that. The other alternative he has is to resign and be replaced by somebody else who will do the same thing. But this is an institutional problem, not an individual one. You can ask yourself what must go on in the mind of someone who knows exactly what he's doing, as of course all the people in high places do, including President Trump, the leader of destruction, who's a firm believer in global warming. So you can, and we know that. So you can ask what goes on in their minds. But at least in the business world, the choices are very restricted. And that is a problem about the nature of institutions. Put different faces in there, they'll face the same problems.
No, and when we consider that annual global subsidies to fossil fuel companies are $5 trillion per year, and that the US government, according to IMF papers, subsidizes the fossil fuel industry to the tune of $700 billion per year. How is it that the mainstream media have expended far more resource to investigating seemingly tenuous links between Donald Trump and Russia rather than interrogating this relationship between the levers of political power and the forces of the sixth extinction?
Well, that was pretty much nonsense at the outset. I mean, the most that anyone was ever going to discover might be that he had a plan to build a Trump hotel in Red Square or something like that. Maybe marginal corruption, but nothing very serious. I don't say that in retrospect. I've been saying it for years. It's clear that there was nothing that was going to come out of the Russiagate, so-called Russiagate inquiry, the Miller inquiry. Any idea that the Russians tried to influence the U.S. elections is laughable. Maybe they tried, who knows, but any possible impact was completely undetectable. And in fact, take a look at the 2016 election. It wasn't just Donald Trump who was elected. Republicans swept the Senate and the House. Was that Russian collusion? Like how? In fact, we know very well from the work by serious political scientists, primarily Thomas Ferguson, that there was a huge influx of money, mostly dark money, for Trump right at the last couple of weeks of the election, when the Republican establishment was concerned that even though they didn't like Trump, that Republican, basically their party, might not win. Why is this massive campaign going out about marginalia, ignoring the major issues? Well, it's a sign of the ineptitude and, in a way, almost irrelevance of the political opposition. They don't disagree all that much with Trump on the main policies. So they're desperately seeking some way to get rid of him so they can take power again and do things that are not very different, maybe a little less outrageous and with a much better style, but not fundamentally different. And in the case of the Democrats, there's also a hard to measure, but undoubtedly a measure of simply an effort for revenge. They ran a really rotten campaign and managed to lose an election that should have been in their pocket to a con man, which I'm sure grates very seriously. So they're trying to bring it down. But what they've been doing is just giving him a huge gift and may have even helped him be elected in the next election. What they should have been doing all along is exactly what you just said, focusing on the policies, not just the case of extreme significance, like global warming, but also other policies. I mean, after there's one legislative achievement of the Trump administration, a tax scam, which poured gifts into the pockets of super rich and the corporate system, and had at the expense of everyone else, also had the side benefit, from the point of view of the Republican establishment, of creating a huge deficit, which can now be used as a pretext to cut away at social benefits, at welfare, at health, at education, at anything that might be of benefit to the unworthy majority. Those are the kinds of issues that, and there are many others I could list, that a serious opposition would have been focusing on, not the remote possibility that somehow Trump is on Putin's payroll, which of course is not going to be true.
So we've established it's unlikely that Russia interfered in US elections in any meaningful way. But does any other state have the power to interfere in US democracy?
Well, there is one state that openly and proudly tries to interfere in U.S. elections, even sending the prime minister to speak to a joint session of Congress without informing the White House, to try to undermine a major program of the White House. Speaking of Benjamin Netanyahu's appearance from Israel in order to try to block Obama's deal with Iran. That's radical interference. But all of that is really pretty marginal. There is massive interference in U.S. elections. Massive. Comes from the corporate sector. It's been demonstrated very effectively, again, in Ferguson's work, that elections in the United States are pretty much bought, in the sense that you can predict the outcome of an election with a very high precision, simply by looking at the single variable of campaign spending. And that's, of course, only one. What that means is not only that those candidates get into office, but that as soon as they get into office, a representative has to spend many hours a day trying to get the donors to fund the donor class to fund his next election. Meanwhile, while the representative, he or she, is doing that, lobbyists, hordes of lobbyists, are pouring into congressional offices to meet with the staffs and craft the legislation which the legislator will sooner or later sign. And we see the consequences of this. Again, there's careful political science research. Martin Gillen, Larry Bartell, Benjamin Page, and others, which shows very convincingly that a considerable majority of the population of voters are literally unrepresented, and that there is no correlation between their own preferences and the voting record of their own representatives, who are listening to other voices, and namely the voices of the donor class. Is that interference in elections? I mean, in comparison with that, anything else you can mention is like a piece of straw on a mountain, you know. So yes, there's massive interference in elections. Some from other states like Israel, and nothing else of any significance. On top of that, the United States has no reluctance at all in substantially not only interfering in elections in other countries, but simply overthrowing the governments if we don't like them. That's serious interference, and it happens all the time. I don't have to run through the record.
So we could say one of the bipartisan orthodoxies in the US political system is regime change. What's happening today in Venezuela now?
Well, the most important case, actually, I'll get to Venezuela in a moment, is Brazil. Now, that's the most important country of Latin America, in fact, in many ways of the global South. And just think back to what happened. Lula da Silva was elected in 2003. 2016, the World Bank published a detailed study of his time in office, which they called the Golden Decade, in which there was enormous progress in Brazil in reduction of poverty, in enhancing inclusiveness, including educational opportunities for marginalized people. The World Bank was full of praise for that and felt that it could have continued with the right policies. But there was a counter-reaction. After Lula left office, a soft coup began. His successor, Dilma Rousseff, was impeached on utterly derisory grounds by a gang of thieves in the parliament. It's shocking. Then came last fall. There was going to be there's an election last October. Lula was poised to win the election. In the public opinion polls, he was well in the lead. They put him in jail. He's in prison, 25-year sentence, solitary confinement, not allowed to read newspapers, and limited visiting hours. I did manage to visit him with my wife, but very limited. And crucially, not permitted to make a public statement, unlike murderers on death row. Okay? You have to silence that voice. And it was silenced. Then came something which is probably a precursor of what we're going to see in 2020 and elsewhere, a huge campaign of vilification, lies, demonization, mainly over the social media, which are the source of information for most of the population. A shocking display. And they managed to put in power the worst of the far-right gangsters who are plaguing the world right now. Lula is, in my opinion, the most important political prisoner in the world. Do you see any discussion or mention of it? No, this was a success of a right-wing coup to beat back the progress that was made. He also became probably the most respected statesman in the world and a strong voice for the global South. That can't be tolerated. Now, Bolsonaro is turning, and his cohorts, Pablo Guedes, the economics minister, ultra-right Chicago product, whose slogan, as he says, is privatize everything, sell off the country to foreign investors. destroy the educational system, cut back research, impose religious extremism, and turn Brazil into a well-behaved colony of the United States. So that's a big success. Now go to Venezuela. Well, a lot to say about it, but during the Chavez years, it was somewhat similar. It doesn't matter much what my opinion was or your opinion, but the opinion of Venezuelans does matter. And that was monitored regularly by Latino Barometro, the main polling agency in Latin America based in Chile, respected for its integrity. It found that Venezuela was ranked right next to Uruguay in the lead in Latin America for support for the government, support for democracy. Well, Chavez died. There were a lot of, I should say, both in the case of Brazil and Venezuela, there's plenty to criticize in the behavior of the ruling parties, but that's not the reason for the coups that are taking place. People who are carrying them out are even worse than they are in many ways. The United States has no reluctance at all in substantially not only interfering in elections in other countries, but simply overthrowing the governments if we don't like them. That's serious interference, and it happens all the time. I don't have to run through the record.
Noam Chomsky, thank you for joining us.